Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 6th of June, where I wanted to put some closure onto Frankenstein and also talk a little bit more about paper number 1, and lastly prepare us for persuasion. So if you can see in the notes below, in the first section about Frankenstein, I've got the instruction to see the attendance question about important quotes. So if you wanted to skip to the very bottom of our notes, what you can see is that our discussion forum question, which will be due on Saturday the 8th, though certainly if you need more time, feel free to ask me. You are to identify an important quote in Frankenstein and, more importantly, indicate why you think that quote is important. So once again, there's no right or wrong answer here. Basically, I'm more interested in your reasoning. Last class, I went through some of the quotes. I had talked about how Mary Shelley was very deliberate about her language, so much so that on the very first page, she quotes from Paradise Lost, that great epic poem by John Milton, where the quote is, "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay, to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote thee?" And certainly we can see lots of parallels with both the creature and with two of the main characters in Paradise Lost, if you've ever read that epic poem, and the creature talks a little bit about that in the text. First, the creature compares himself to Adam, and if you know the biblical story of Adam and Eve, Adam didn't have a partner, and God created a partner so that Adam wouldn't suffer from loneliness. And this is what the creature requests. And also the creature compares himself to Lucifer, or Satan, happens to be a major character in Paradise Lost, who comes off in a rather sympathetic way, unlike in the Christian mythology that Lucifer was created and yet was abandoned. So that said, I leave it up to you to find a quote that you think has some relevance and discussing the reasons why. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And what you should get is a nice overview of some of the important quotes in the text. And if you do care to respond to your classmates, you could think of it in the way that you would be responding in a face-to-face class, just by raising your hand if something occurred to you that you wanted to contribute. And that leads us to talking about paper number 1. And as I had briefly discussed before, paper number 1 is a critical paper. So I'm not asking you to consult any outside resources. I'm asking you to interpret on your own. And paper number 1 will be focused on our first set of readings, which began with The Story of an Hour, the short story by Kate Chopin, moved into Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which is where we are now, Persuasion, which is where we are heading, Jane Austen, and perhaps Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. The problem with Jane Eyre is that it straddles both the first and the second part of the semester. I think Jane Eyre would probably be better suited for paper number 2, because paper number 2 is going to be very similar to what you are going to be doing with paper number 1, just with a different set of readings. And I had selected a quote from The Cult of True Womanhood, which is laying the foundation basically for this class, and having you apply that quote to some of the texts that we are reading this semester. But certainly you can come up with your own topic. If you do, just make sure you have that topic approved by me ahead of time. And everybody has the option of rewriting that first paper for a higher grade. I see it as a kind of practice exercise. And today I wanted to review some of the conventions for writing a paper. And I'm hopeful that this is a review, that this is something that you talked about in your previous English classes, though I don't want to assume anything. Feel free to submit in drafts if you'd like for feedback, but regardless of whether or not you submit in a draft, everybody has the option of revising the first paper after I've evaluated it, and for grammar, mechanics, and content, and I've returned that back to you. And paper number 2 is going to be very similar to what you did with paper number 1. And certainly you can incorporate some of the information from the discussion forum questions into your paper as well. That's part of the learning exercise. So I have uploaded a handout for you in the Syllabus and Other Documents folder entitled The Critical Paper that I wanted to go through with you. Actually, this was a handout that was, believe it or not, distributed to me in my undergraduate years many moons ago, and it's still one of the best that I've found in terms of how to go through writing a literary analysis. And basically, the handout is divided into 3 sections: the planning section, the writing section, and the editing section. And I can tell you right now that most writers skip the planning section and they go straight into the writing section, making things much more difficult for themselves, because what they're trying to do is to create the perfect first sentence rather than generate ideas ahead of time. And for almost everyone, it's a much better and more time efficient process to first generate ideas in no particular order, and you might not utilize those ideas, whether you brainstorm or you list, and that you begin early so that you can do this paper in pieces rather than do it in a short amount of time. And then once you've got some ideas, then you can begin to organize them in the way that you think you're likely to want to discuss them in a paper. Then you can begin to discuss those ideas and formulate sentences and paragraphs. Again, not terribly worried about the grammar or the mechanics, because that's something that you can work on after the fact. Then you can work on the actual polishing of the writing and the editing that comes afterwards. And I can tell you that most writers will skip the editing portion as well, because they've spent so much time on the writing portion that they don't have time to really edit, and they don't have the energy either, or the inclination to edit. So I encourage you to begin early, and also to spend a good amount of time with the planning stage, which is where you should be now. You may already know that you are going to or not going to write about the story of An Hour of Frankenstein. We have Persuasion coming up. That'll be another option for you. And that gives you enough time to write and to edit afterwards. So just a couple of points about writing that, again, I hope are review. That your paper should be divided up into an introductory paragraph, and that's usually where you give your thesis, and that's the main point of your argument, which can be challenging because you may not know what the main point of your argument is until you've actually written the paper. So that's part of the process of writing, is that you can discover after the fact. So what you might want to do is just write out ideas. And then once you've begun to formulate sentences around those ideas, reread what you've written and summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences. That could be your thesis that you plug in after the fact into your introduction. You don't have to write in chronological order. And the introduction is also where you give the name of the author and the name of the text that you are discussing, so it's very clear to the reader what it is you are going to be talking about. And then you have body paragraphs in the plural. These are multiple paragraphs that are devoted to analyzing the text itself. It's your evidence, if you will. This is where you use quotation, direct language from the text, and paraphrase, language that you put into your own words. And you should use a combination of the two. And basically what I tell my writing students is that you are, in effect, attorneys, and you're trying to put together a court case to support a position. And a good attorney can argue either guilty or innocent, and can argue either side. Of course, sometimes the evidence is stronger on one side than another, but a good attorney can gather those pieces of evidence that would make their side seem possible. And that's basically what you're doing. So when you are going through your particular thesis, it should be something that reasonable people could disagree about. It's not just a fact. And again, you're trying to support that with evidence, whether it be quotation or paraphrase from the text. And it doesn't matter if I agree or disagree. I would be, in effect, a kind of judge, a neutral party. So even if I've said, let's say in a class video, I've taken a perspective about something. For instance, I might have said that Victor Frankenstein is very similar to his creature. That doesn't mean that that is a given if you're writing that in a paper. You have to support that by giving evidence from the text itself so that your position is possible. And then finally, you have a concluding paragraph, and this is where you give closure. You don't introduce any new paragraphs. You try to tie up everything that you've done. Keep in mind that a paragraph is supposed to be devoted to one topic, and the first sentence of a paragraph is known as the topic sentence. Usually that topic sentence summarizes what the paragraph is about. Not always, but usually. So if you've got something that's well written, you should be able to read just the first sentences of all the paragraphs and get, in effect, a kind of summary or outline, which is something that you can test with your own writing and also test in other pieces of writing. In theory, this should work with a textbook if the textbook is well written. And as we know, sometimes textbooks are not particularly well written. And a paragraph is defined as 3 or more sentences, at least from an academic perspective. There are other kinds of writing, for instance, journalistic writing, where you could write a 1-sentence paragraph. But when we talk about academic writing, which is the kind of writing that's expected of you in the workplace, so this is how the connection occurs, you need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's where the minimum 3 sentences comes from. You probably need a whole lot more. And the reality is that I know that by the ending of the paper, you're probably going to be tired and you're not going to have much to say in your concluding paragraph. But your concluding paragraph needs to have as much depth, 3 or more sentences, as any of the other paragraphs as well. And I know that some of you might have been schooled in the 5-paragraph essay, that you have an introductory paragraph and then 3 body paragraphs, 3 pieces of evidence, and a concluding paragraph. And that's fine as a beginning, but it certainly isn't where you want to have an end stop. So usually in more advanced classes, we're going beyond the 5-paragraph essay. And at bare bones minimum, an essay has to be 3 paragraphs with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it should be much longer than that. So in terms of the handout that I had uploaded for you to review, you can see that it talks about some of these pieces more in depth, that your job is to analyze, not to summarize. So this isn't what I call the junior high school book report. You basically are interpreting for the reader, which means that the bulk of your sentences should be based on analysis. Again, begin with an opening paragraph with a strong thesis. You don't want to say something that's too general. For instance, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. I mean, basically, that's true of all pieces of literature, or any good pieces of literature. So you've basically said nothing. Or saying something to the effect of, Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. My first response is, yeah, so what? It's not about what imagery, or it's not about the fact that imagery was employed, it's about what imagery and why. And as I had indicated, the topic sentences of each paragraph, more often than not, basically summarize what your paragraph is. And that while you want to use quotation and paraphrase, generally you don't want to end a paragraph with a quotation, because you usually comment on the relevance of that quote. And you want to avoid extremes. You want a paper that doesn't, you want to avoid a paper that has no quotation. You need quotation as evidence. But you also don't want to just insert quotation to give your paper length, because you don't really have anything to say. So when teachers talk about page length, they're talking about argument, not necessarily words. So your paper is approximately 4 to 5 pages long. And by approximately, I mean approximately. It should be as long as it needs to be to support your argument. So many times what I do when I'm reading a paper is I'm deleting unnecessary language, things that can be said much more concisely. And that's the general rule of thumb. And something that you should spend a good amount of time with in the editing phase is rereading each sentence to yourself and asking yourself, can I say this in fewer words? And if so, you should probably do so. And I understand how painful that could be, because now you're losing length. But length should come from argumentation, not from language. So wordiness is a major issue with writers, myself included. So even English teachers have issues with writing. We use more language when we speak than when we write. So you should have enough time to see if you can tighten up your writing. And of course, the conclusion, again, you just don't want to repeat what you said in your introduction. Um, Perhaps you can restate some important points. Perhaps you can hint at a related point by the same author or at a text that's similar. 9 out of 10 times, if you don't know how to end the paper, if you relate it to present day, that's something that would usually work, almost always. In terms of the writing, and you can see that in the writing section of the critical paper handout, the first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So you want to have strong verbs and nouns. Action words are verbs, and nouns, persons, places, things. Adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words, can be handy, but don't use them to the point where you're just trying to give your paper length. So you're using lots of synonyms to describe something, and it really isn't necessary. The active to the passive voice, you might have heard suggestions that you should be using the active voice, or in other words, very clearly indicate when the subject of the sentence is engaged in an action, as opposed to the action happening to the subject of a sentence. And the subject of the sentence is indeed a noun, but it's not just any old noun. It's who or what is performing the action. So if you had a sentence like Lillian graded the papers, well, Lillian and papers are both nouns. They're people, places, things, or ideas. But only one is the subject. The subject is Lillian because Lillian engaged in the grading. So Lillian graded the papers would be active, as opposed to passive, which would be something like the papers were graded by Lillian, as if the action were occurring to me. It's not a mechanical error, it's a question of style. But go back to the suggestion of the first principle of good writing is economy. Lillian graded the papers as 4 words. The papers were graded by Lillian as 6 words. And if you do this with each sentence and you eliminate unnecessary language, your writing will be tighter. Better to have something that's shorter and well written than something that's longer, but that could be improved in terms of its constructions. So avoid 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, avoid cliches, overused expressions that no longer have any originality to them. And it's very similar to things like expressions that we use, like the grass is always greener, it's raining cats and dogs, that is a doornail. Also, you want to avoid any slang, informal language that isn't considered standard. Slang is usually created by each generation to try to exclude individuals. And then ultimately, sometimes slang will go mainstream, so everybody's using it. So if I were to say somebody is a cool person, I'm not necessarily talking about their temperature. I'm talking about their personality, their temperament. But imagine if English were not your first language, how difficult it would be first to learn that cool means a lower temperature. And in certain contexts, it also means an engaging personality. That's one of the reasons why we tell individuals to avoid the use of slang in their formal writing, and also to avoid cliches. Again, a lot of times they're nonsensical. Why do we say it's raining cats and dogs? And why do cats come before the dogs? Imagine again if English were your first language. So I know that some of you are returning students, so you've heard this story before, but I think it emphasizes the point about why these rules are not just arbitrary. And it was based on a true life story, I believe from the 1990s, where it was a second language student who was going to a party, and he went to the wrong home, a home that had been, it turns out, burglarized previously. So let's just say the owner of the home was anxious. Well, the student knocks on the door and the owner opens, and the student asks, is this where the party's happening? Owner responds with a piece of slang that I suspect most, if not all of you, know. The owner says freeze, which in a slang context means to stop. Though technically freeze is when a liquid becomes a solid, let's say. Or for whatever reason, whether this second language student misheard or misunderstood, took a step forward, and then ultimately the owner pulled out the gun that he always carried with him and shot it off and killed that student on his doorstep. So true story. And it goes to show about how there is a greater possibility of misunderstanding and miscommunication if you don't have standardization with language. So that's why we have some of these rules in place, which I liken to driving. We all have to follow the rules. Of course, there is a little bit of leeway. We can use our discretion sometimes, but we need to know why we're doing what we're doing, and there needs to be a good reason for it. So one thing that will seem completely counterintuitive is to maintain the present tense. So when we talk about literature, we talk about it in the now, as if it is happening in the moment rather than in the past. So it's not that the creature said to Victor, it's that the creature says to Victor. And that might be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. Again, the reason why we do it is to give this kind of timeless and universal sense to literature. But if you are having difficulty with doing this, use the past tense, but then when you get to the editing portion, change everything from the past to the present. And then there is the editing or the presentation portion. You want to proofread very carefully. And if you have difficulty concentrating, you might want to start at the ending of your paper and work your way to the beginning. Of course, the content won't make sense, but that allows you to really pay attention to the sentences and to the punctuation. Your paper should have a title, and it should be original. So you shouldn't name your paper, for instance, The Story of an Hour, if you are writing about the story of an hour. That title's already been taken by Chopin. You can, however, incorporate the author's title into your own title. So you could have a title that says something to the effect of Symbolism in the Story of an Hour. Now, we have conventions when we are referencing titles that have been published previously. So if it is a short story, it appears in quotation marks. And in other words, if it's something shorter, that can appear in something larger. If it is a novel, or a drama, we either underline it or italicize it. So again, if you were handwriting, you wouldn't have the option of an italicization, so we would underline it. So keep that in mind if you are referencing the title and within your own title, because your own title should not be underlined or put in quotation marks or in a larger font or bolded or anything else. It should be as standard as all of the other writing, which is usually considered to be 12-point font, something like a standard font like Times or Times New Roman. So to give you an idea how old this handout is, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. Your paper does need to be typed, double spaced, 1-inch margins. I am asking for a cover page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that lists your name, my name, the due date, the paper title. This is information that's also included in your syllabus. And I'm asking that you submit that paper via PDF to my email, which is how my grading program works best, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And again, you've got some time for that first paper, but I wanted you to begin thinking about possibilities. And if you look at the notes below, I've also indicated some information about quotation. So the good news about quotation is that since you aren't using outside resources, it will be an easier exercise for you. We use a system based on the MLA, which stands for Modern Language Association. And this is the professional organization that's determined these rules for writing, specifically for the humanities and for languages, which is what we are. There are different systems for different disciplines. So you might be familiar with APA, American Psychological Association. That's reserved for the sciences. So you want to make sure that you're using the right system for the right discipline. We're using the MLA, which uses parentheses immediately after a quote, and within those parentheses, it lists the least amount of information necessary for a reader to determine where that quote comes from. And basically what that usually means is a page number, and you don't have to write page or PG or P or anything like that, just the numeral. If it turns out that you're using multiple sources, then you might need, and it's not clear which source you're referencing, you might need to include the author's last name in the page number. If you're using multiple sources from the same author, then you might need to include part of the title and the author's last name and the page number. So it keeps building upon itself. And basically, all of this comes together with a works cited page, which is what's included at the ending of a paper that lists all of the works you've cited or you've quoted from. And all those works are listed in alphabetical order by author surname. And there are particular systems in place for citing a book as opposed to a magazine article, as opposed to a website. And basically, you just look up your situation. It's almost like looking in a cookbook, and you just follow the directions exactly. So a reader basically is using the information that you've given in the parentheses to determine whether or not they want to verify your quote. If they do want to verify your quote, they go to the ending of the paper and they look up by author's last name the text in which that quote appeared, and that includes the edition, because the edition will be important in terms of having similar page numbers. And then if they so wanted to, they could get a hold of that edition and they could verify it. They probably wouldn't, but this is the reason why we use this system, and this is how it all goes together. So in the third section, the notes below, I've given some examples of how you go about doing that. So the punctuation we use is quotation mark, and the quotation marks indicate when this is not your language, it's someone else's. And after the quotation, in parentheses, you would put, let's say, 162, and then close your parentheses, and then put your ending punctuation, as is in the first example, punctuation after documentation. Quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college. However, you don't necessarily need to end your sentence. If you were to continue to end continue your sentence rather than end it, well, then you do put the parentheses and the identifying information within the parentheses after the quote, and then continue on your sentence. So for instance, sentence continuation after documentation. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, then open parentheses, 162, close parentheses, he could not pray with his mother. So the sentence continued, but the quote ended before the ending of the sentence. Now, you do have a little bit of latitude with quotations. Sometimes you might want to insert something into a quote, your own language. Usually, if you're inserting something, you are clarifying. It's certainly not giving commentary, because you can give commentary before or after a quote. Very frequently, it happens with pronouns, that you might be using a pronoun in a quote and it might be unclear which character you're referencing based on just the quote that you've selected. So I give you an example here of an insertion. Quote, even his, and then in square brackets, not parentheses, square brackets, I have the word Krebs's lies were not sensational. Close quote, and then parentheses 162. Close parentheses, and then an ending punctuation of a period. So what's in those square brackets, this is my insertion. The word Krebs never appeared in that original quote. I've added it in to clarify for the reader. Likewise, you might want to leave out a part of a quote. And I'm not talking about the beginning or the ending of a quote, because you can decide where to start a quote. You can decide where to end a quote. You can start a quote mid-sentence. You can end a quote mid-sentence. But in between your start and stop point, if in between those 2 points you want to leave out something, and you're leaving it out because it's irrelevant, not because you want to change the meaning of something, that would be unethical. What you use is an ellipsis, which is 3 periods. And an example is in the third section, the notes below, under omission. Krebs, comma, quote, during this time, period, was sleeping late in bed, unquote, and then in parentheses 162, close parentheses, period. So that means between the words time and was, there were other words that I thought were irrelevant, so I left them out. Those 3 periods, or the ellipsis, lets you know that if you were to examine the original quote, you would see that omission. So, a couple of suggestions. Oh, also, block quote. If you are quoting a long piece of text, usually that's over 3 lines, what you do is you indent it inward so that it looks like a block. And that makes it easier for the reader to see where the quote begins, and more importantly, where it ends, because we've usually become trained that when you are starting a quote, the ending is coming fairly quickly. So if you've got a long quote, and again, generally that's over 3 lines long, you would use the block quotation format. You might have seen this in books where a quote is indented. In this instance, you don't use quotation marks. And the reason why is because it's considered redundant. By indenting in the quote, blocking it off, you're telling the reader this is a quote, so you don't need to use quotation marks. And in this instance, ending punctuation comes first and then parenthetical documentation. I have no good reason why. It just is the way it is. It's almost like how driving rules are different from one state to another. We just have to kind of follow the rules. So I'm hopeful that this was a review that for those of you who already know this information, it wasn't too long-winded. For those of you who've never heard this information, I wasn't going too quickly, hopefully. You might have resources that you yourself are fond of in terms of helping you write papers. Perhaps it's an old handbook. I have 2 online resources that are free that I highly recommend that are in the 3rd section of the notes below that you might have heard of before. One is Purdue OWL. It was or is a website from Purdue University, and it talks about the entire writing process from the very beginning, generating ideas, to the very end, handing in the final copy, and everything in between, including conventions for quoting, which oftentimes is challenging for students. And luckily, Purdue University has made it widely available to everyone. We don't have to be students at Purdue to access it. But keep in mind you're a GCC student if you're taking this class, and you all have access, even though the public doesn't, to the GCC library system. And the GCC library is well aware that you are going to be writing papers and quoting, so I've given the link below with citation. Now, if you remember, I had indicated that because you're writing a critical paper, you're going to have an easier time of it with citation. What this means is that since you are only referencing the actual text itself that you're analyzing, and you aren't using outside resources, you do not, for my purposes, need to include a works cited page. So you don't need to include that last page that would list all of the works you're citing, because you are basically just citing one work. So I would be perfectly satisfied without that works cited page. Certainly, if you're using outside resources or more than one source, then you're going to have to include a works cited page. If you decide to hand in a works cited page, you want to do it correctly, so that if it turns out you want the practice in doing it, then you want to do that correctly. But the assumption is that you've already had experience doing this, so that you can just focus on the parenthetical documentation within the text. And of course, you can always ask me questions about this as well. I understand this is a lot of information at once, and I hope it's a review. And Persuasion, and I had shared with you the link for that last class. Whenever I am able to find a free link, I'll share that with you. Is a very different kind of text. And I had indicated that perhaps it's the slowest moving text of this semester. It's the world's, or a glimpse into the world of the British landed gentry. So what we've got are people with a good amount of prestige, a good amount of power, a good amount of agency. They have a lot of leisure. And consequently, you'll see that they're looking for ways to fill their day, oftentimes with gossip and with dances, and taking a long walk becomes a major episode. Keep in mind that they didn't have necessarily the transportation options that we have today, so in many ways they were very small circles of their social connections. And especially if you were of the landed gentry, you wanted to remain in that class or higher, so you have very fewer options. And if you haven't started Persuasion yet, you will find when you do that marriage is centrally important, and making sure that you make a good match. And even though the landed gentry certainly had more power and privilege and agency, as we saw with the Cult of True Womanhood, there would be a distinction between the males and the females, as we see in Persuasion as well. The author writes long classical sentences with little action, I think to try to simulate the kind of lifestyle these individuals would have lived. You're not supposed to like the Elliot family, who is the family that we are focusing on. So when you're reading about Sir Walter, he comes off as a very unattractive character. We learn some of the distinctions between being a widower like Sir Walter and a widow, Lady Elliot, which I had talked a little bit about when we were reading the story of an hour, about how it was, just from a sociological perspective, more common for men to remarry if they lost their spouse than for women to remarry. And while I assume there are many reasons for that, money and power probably are some of the elements that were of consideration. And the title of the book, Persuasion, is going to be important, to gently influence. That's basically what the author is trying to do with us as well, to gently influence us about the kind of vacuous and empty lifestyle of many of these characters. We get a female protagonist. In this way, this text is much more progressive than what we saw with Frankenstein. Her name is Anne Elliot, and basically we see the world through her eyes. So we learn a great deal about her through her perceptions. And there will be a good number of characters, and sometimes they will be referred to by their surnames, and sometimes by their first names, and sometimes by their titles. So it can be rather confusing, and the names are oftentimes similar, if not identical. Lots of Williams, for instance, that's considered to be a rather, royal name. If you know anything about the British monarchy, then you know that there's some names that are repeated over and over again. Charles is one, for instance, which is the current monarch in place. Henry, that's another one. So I suggest that you keep a chart of the character relationships, and it's something that I'll be sharing with you next class, because that should definitely help you with the understanding of this text. What would be ideal is that you will have finished reading Persuasion by our next class on Tuesday. I understand the world isn't always ideal. That may not necessarily be possible, but do the best that you can. And I will introduce Persuasion next class. And of course, I will introduce a link to our next reading, because my hope is that you keep ahead with the readings. The good news is that Jane Eyre, even though it's a longer text, it moves much more quickly in terms of action. And then you'll see that the texts following Jane Eyre are much more accessible. So with that said, I leave you with the attendance question, which again was in reference to Frankenstein, where I'm going to ask you to identify a quote that you feel is important in the text and talk about some of the reasons why you think is important. That'll be due on Saturday the 8th. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class by talking about Persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.